In the year 922, a Muslim diplomat named Ahmad ibn Fadlan stood among Viking raiders on the banks of the Volga River. What he saw would haunt him forever. A young slave girl, chosen to join her dead master, was forced into days of ritual intimacy with the men of the tribe. And when it ended, she was strangled with a cord, stabbed with a blade, and burned alive beside her chieftain. Ibn Fadlan recorded every detail. For centuries, his words were dismissed as enemy propaganda. But modern archaeology has confirmed that he was telling the truth. Close your eyes and step into his place. The night air cuts like a knife, sharp with frost. Smoke from pitch torches coils into the sky, heavy with the stench of resin and burning wood. The river glimmers black, reflecting orange tongues of flame. A circle of warriors surrounds the funeral ship. Their shields catch the firelight. Their eyes gleam like embers. Not one face shows pity. Instead, their gaze is reverent, as though witnessing a sacred rite. The girl staggers forward, her breath thick with mead, and narcotics forced on her to dull her fear. Her hair clings to her face with sweat. She sobs, but the sound is drowned by the pounding of drums, slow, relentless, like the heartbeat of a god. An old woman known as the Angel of Death whispers in her ear, guiding her, pushing her. One by one, the men approach. The creak of leather, the smell of sweat and iron. They lean close, whispering into her ear, "Tell your master I did this for him." The chanting grows louder. Shadows leap across the ship's carved dragon prow, twisting like demons in the firelight. The girl's cries turn hoarse, then faint. The final act comes swiftly. The cord tightening around her throat, the knife flashing once, and then the crackle of flames as her body collapses beside her master's. For the Vikings, this was holy. For us, it is unbearable horror. And this was not an exception. Sexuality bled into every corner of Viking life, into their weddings, their laws, their raids, even their gods. If this is how they honored the dead, then what unspeakable practices did they unleash upon the living? The Viking Age began in the late 8th century, when sleek longships first sliced across the waters of northern Europe. To monasteries along the English coast, the sudden appearance of dragon-prowed vessels felt like the arrival of demons. But to the Norse, it was the natural extension of their world, a culture built on expansion, honor, and dominance. The Norse homeland was harsh fjords carved by ice, winters that bit like iron, soil that yielded little. Survival demanded risk. From Scandinavia, the Vikings spread outward, raiding England, Ireland, France, sailing into the rivers of Russia, even reaching the shimmering markets of Baghdad. Wherever they went, they carried not only axes and trade goods, but also their beliefs about power, gender, and sexuality. Picture the scene of a raid, the hiss of arrows, the crack of doors splintering under axes, the screams of villagers carried on salt air. And behind the plundered gold and burning thatch came another form of conquest, human captives dragged to ships, bound for markets where flesh was as valuable as silver. Viking society was built on sharp contrasts. Free men and women enjoyed rights unknown in most of medieval Europe. Women could inherit land, demand divorce, and control property. But beneath them was a vast underclass. The thralls, slaves captured in raids or born into bondage. For the free, sexuality carried rules, protections, and even legal recourse. For the enslaved, the body was simply property. Viking law codes recorded the difference with chilling clarity. To violate a free woman could mean exile or death. To rape a slave meant only a fine, as if one had damaged livestock. The smell of livestock pens, the shuffle of chained feet, the muttered prayers of captives waiting to be sold in Dublin or York. This was the background hum of Viking wealth. Honor was the lifeblood of Norse society, and it extended into the bedroom. To be called arger unmanly, sexually passive, was more dangerous than being called a thief. Icelandic law, stated that accusing a man of such weakness justified murder. In a culture where warriors carved reputations with steel, a whispered insult could be deadlier than a sword. The sagas record entire feuds sparked by such accusations. A single word, muttered over a cup of mead in a smoky hall, could send men riding through snow to kill and burn in the name of wounded masculinity. Even the gods were entangled in this obsession. Odin, greatest of the seiðr, was mocked for practicing seiðr, a type of sorcery associated with women. Loki, trickster and shapeshifter, gave birth to monsters after taking female form. To the Vikings, these myths were not simply entertainment. They reflected anxieties about gender, power, and the thin line between dominance and disgrace. Imagine sitting in a longhouse, the smoke thick, the fire snapping, a skald chanting tales of gods accused of effeminacy, while warriors around you laughed nervously. Even divine beings could fall from honor. What, then, of mortals? The result was a society where intimacy was inseparable from hierarchy. Who you touched, how you touched, even the role you played in bed, all of it shaped your standing. Free women wielded surprising autonomy, but slaves lived and died at the mercy of their owners. Men staked reputations on their ability to dominate, and women could destroy reputations with a few public words. Power was not abstract. It was carved into bodies, sealed in law, and whispered in sagas that still echo. The sagas of the North were more than stories. They were living memory, whispered in smoky longhouses, shouted across battlefields, and written down centuries later by Christian scribes who often painted the Vikings as monsters. Between fact and fiction, between history and horror, lies a space where truth and rumor blur. One of the most haunting tales is the neathing insult, the shame stroke. The sagas describe warriors cutting or stabbing the buttocks of defeated enemies to symbolize forced submission. It was a wound meant not to kill, but to humiliate, branding a man forever as conquered in the most intimate way. Imagine the scene: the battlefield quiet after slaughter, snow stained with blood, and a single warrior kneeling as his enemy drives a blade across his flesh, not to end his life, but to erase his honor. To the Norse, such an act was worse than death. Other sagas whisper of weddings turned into spectacles. Families gathered outside the bridal chamber, ears pressed to wooden doors, listening for proof that the marriage had been sealed. Some tales go further, claiming uncles or brothers remained in the room as witnesses. Was this exaggeration or legal necessity? The sagas differ. Yet the rumor alone reveals a society where intimacy was never private, and where fertility was a public concern, tied to property and bloodlines rather than love. The sagas also tell of curses woven with sexual humiliation. In Egil's saga, insults of unmanliness led to blood feuds that lasted generations. Words alone could brand a man as passive, stripping him of rights and forcing him into exile. Picture a hall thick with smoke, mead sloshing in horns, and a woman's voice rising above the noise. "My husband is too gentle in bed." Laughter erupts. For the man, the insult is fatal. His masculinity shattered, his reputation ruined. He rides out the next morning with axe in hand, knowing only blood can wash the stain away. Tales spread of Viking leaders keeping harems of enslaved women taken from Ireland, Scotland, and the Slavic lands. The sagas often describe this casually, as though women were spoils of war like silver or cattle. Yet Christian chroniclers twisted these accounts further, painting the Norse as lust-mad heathens. How much was truth? And how much was propaganda meant to terrify neighboring kingdoms into submission? Ibn Fadlan's account of the slave girl's sacrifice became legend across Europe. Monks retold it as proof of Viking barbarity, adding lurid details. Orgies around funeral pyres, priests blessing acts of violence, women dancing naked before the flames. But archaeology complicates the tale. Ship burials in Oseberg and other sites reveal young women buried with high-status men, some showing signs of violent death. Was this myth, exaggeration, or grim reality? The line is thin. Even the myths of the gods carried sexual rumor. Loki transforming into a mare and birthing Odin's horse. Odin practicing women's magic. In Christian retellings, these stories became proof of Norse perversity. But within the sagas, they also carried deeper meaning, a warning of the dangers of stepping outside prescribed roles. The line between legend and truth is always blurred. But when we turn to the records, laws, sagas, eyewitness accounts, and the graves dug from northern soil, the picture of Viking sexuality becomes sharper and far more disturbing. The most chilling testimony remains that of Ahmad ibn Fadlan in 922. His account describes, in clinical detail, the sacrifice of a slave girl at a chieftain's funeral. He notes how she was plied with alcohol, violated by men of the tribe, and then strangled and stabbed before being placed beside her master on a burning ship. For centuries, scholars dismissed this as propaganda from a Muslim, horrified by barbarian customs. Yet excavations of ship burials, like the Oseberg grave in Norway, have revealed young female skeletons buried with elite males, some showing trauma consistent with violent death. The horror Ibn Fadlan described was not fantasy. It left bones in the earth. Viking law, recorded in texts like the Gragas of Iceland, reveals a society obsessed with sexual honor. The codes state that accusing a man of being unmanly, sexually passive, was so grave an insult that the accused had the right to kill the insulter without punishment. Other laws drew brutal lines between classes. To rape a free woman was a crime punishable by outlawry or death. To rape a slave woman, it carried only a fine, calculated as though one had damaged property. In the ink of these laws, we see a cold calculus: sexuality as hierarchy, intimacy as contract, and human bodies reduced to legal categories. The Icelandic sagas, written down in the 13th and 14th centuries, are saturated with sexual insults, humiliations, and feuds born from whispered rumors. In Njal's saga, a man is accused of wearing clothing too feminine, grounds for mockery that escalates into bloodshed. In Njal's saga, sexual slander sparks a feud that stains the snow with blood. In the saga of the people of Laxardal, a woman publicly denounces her husband's weakness in bed, unraveling his honor before the entire community. These aren't simply colorful stories. They reveal how fragile masculinity was in Viking culture, and how reputation could be destroyed by a single phrase shouted in a hall thick with smoke and laughter. Excavations at Dublin, York, and Hedeby show evidence of bustling slave markets, with shackles, pens, and trade records revealing the scale of human trafficking. Historians estimate that up to 30% of some Viking settlements were slaves, many captured specifically for sexual exploitation. Imagine walking through a Viking town, the clang of blacksmiths, the cries of merchants, and in the shadows, chained men and women waiting to be sold. Their fate depended not on their will, but on the desire of those with silver. Even ritual artifacts speak of sexuality. Thor's hammer amulets, found in graves and settlements, often lay on the laps of brides during wedding ceremonies as a fertility symbol. Archaeologists have uncovered bedposts carved with entwined figures, suggesting that marital intimacy was sanctified in communal and legal ways. The Oseberg burial contained not only the remains of two women, but sleds and carved panels with erotic imagery, proof that sexuality was not hidden, but displayed even in death. Some sagas describe criminals punished with castration or sexual humiliation, and archaeological sites provide eerie confirmation. Excavated execution grounds show bodies mutilated in ways consistent with ritualized violence: groins slashed, buttocks stabbed, genitals removed. These were not accidents of war. They were performances. punishments designed to mirror the shame they inflicted. Picture a public square in Iceland. Villagers gathered, frost clinging to cloaks, as an adulterer is dragged forward. Instead of a quick death, his punishment is staged humiliation, a message to all that sexual order must be preserved through spectacle. And yet, in the same records, we see striking contradictions. Viking women of free status could inherit land, run businesses, and divorce their husbands with relative ease. Some sagas describe women who commanded ships, arranged marriages, and wielded wealth. But this freedom only highlights the brutality below. For every free woman with rights, there were countless enslaved women treated as spoils of war. The laws protecting one group sharpened the chains on the other. From the sagas to the graves, from ink on parchment to scars on bone, the evidence is undeniable. Viking sexuality was inseparable from violence, hierarchy, and power. But the records tell us only what happened. They cannot capture the experience. To glimpse that, we must turn to the strange and terrifying phenomena that ripple beneath these facts. The whispered rituals, the uncanny events, the moments so disturbing they blur the line between history and nightmare. And those, perhaps, are the hardest to explain. Some practices leave traces in bones, in sagas, in law codes. Others linger, like ghosts phenomena, so disturbing, so alien to modern eyes, that historians struggle to explain them. These are the moments when Viking sexuality bleeds into the uncanny. The sagas describe weddings not as celebrations of love, but as public trials of fertility. Families gathered outside the bridal chamber, ears pressed to the door, waiting to hear proof of consummation. Some tales go further. In Grettir's saga, an uncle is said to have remained in the room to witness the act. In others, bloodied sheets were carried out the next morning and displayed as legal evidence of virginity. Was this literal truth or metaphor? Archaeologists have uncovered bridal crowns, Thor's hammer amulets, and even preserved bedding in graves, suggesting the rituals were deeply symbolic. But whether families truly listened at the door, or whether the sagas exaggerated, remains impossible to confirm. What is certain is the terror such customs inspired. Imagine being a young bride, forced to perform under the weight of an entire family's judgment, knowing your honor and property rights hung on the sounds of a single night. The so-called nithingr, shame stroke, cutting or stabbing a man's buttocks to mark him as sexually conquered, appears again and again in the sagas. Archaeologists have found skeletons with wounds in precisely these locations, but interpretation is murky. Were these battle injuries, accidents, or deliberate acts of humiliation? The pattern suggests intention. Yet no law code describes such a punishment. It remains one of the most haunting mysteries. Why would a warrior culture waste time marking enemies in such a way, unless the act itself carried supernatural weight? Perhaps they believed humiliation stripped not just honor, but spiritual power. The practice of seiðr, a form of sorcery, often associated with women, was considered both powerful and shameful when performed by men. Sources say that men who practiced it risked being branded as argur, unmanly. Yet sagas also suggest that such men wielded terrifying powers, cursing enemies, seeing the future, controlling minds. The contradiction is eerie. Why fear and scorn a practice that brought victory? One theory is that the sexual undertones of seiðr involving trance, submission, and bodily openness blurred gender boundaries in ways the Norse found both useful and horrifying. Even Odin, the Allfather, was accused of effeminacy for mastering it. Was this just political insult, or a hidden acknowledgement that sexuality itself was tied to supernatural force? Beyond Ibn Fadlan's testimony, traces of ritual killing appear in graves across Scandinavia. The Oseberg ship contained 2 women, one elderly, one young, buried together with signs of violence. Other sites show male chieftains accompanied by female skeletons, often with broken bones or strangulation marks, but the details are elusive. Were these women wives, slaves, priestesses? Were their deaths voluntary sacrifice or forced murder? The sagas offer little clarity. Christian chroniclers emphasized brutality, but archaeology suggests ritual. The mystery deepens when we consider the role of sexuality in these sacrifices. Ibn Fadlan describes the slave girl as a vessel of collective desire, carrying life force into the afterlife. Was this belief widespread? If so, then Viking funerals were not only about death, but about a terrifying alchemy of sex, power, and eternity. Whispers of systematic rape used as psychological warfare appear in both chronicles and sagas. Some stories claim entire towns surrendered to avoid it. Others suggest male captives were assaulted to strip them of honor. Yet evidence is fragmentary. Did Vikings truly weaponize sexuality so deliberately, or did terrified victims exaggerate? Historians remain divided. What is clear is that these stories, true or not, worked. The fear of such treatment was enough to break communities before swords were even drawn. The phenomenon, then, is less about the act itself and more about the atmosphere of dread it created. Finally, the myths themselves blur into strange territory. Loki birthing a horse, Odin practicing forbidden magic, Frey accused of incest with his sister Freya. Were these divine scandals meant as entertainment or as coded warnings about taboo behaviors among mortals? The sagas record them without clear judgment, leaving us with ambiguity. Did the Vikings truly believe their gods transgressed the same sexual boundaries they enforced so brutally on Earth? Or were these tales whispered reminders that even divine power carried shadows? From bridal beds that became courtrooms, to sorcery laced with sexuality, to graves hiding stories too grim to name, Viking life was filled with phenomena that still defy explanation. Were these practices real, exaggerated, or symbolic? The evidence offers no simple answers. But one thing is clear. The Norse obsession with sex, power, and humiliation left echoes that did not end with the Viking Age. Those echoes still shape how we imagine them today, long after the longships have rotted away. The Viking Age ended 1,000 years ago, yet their shadow still lingers. The echoes of their sexuality, part horror, part fascination, continue to shape culture, scholarship, and imagination today. From television series like Vikings and The Last Kingdom to Marvel's Thor films, the Norse are everywhere. But these retellings often sanitize what sagas and chronicles describe. On screen, Viking weddings become romantic, their gods noble warriors. Rarely do we see the darker truths: marriages as public trials, insults that killed, funerals steeped in sex and blood. Still, fragments slip through. Vikings depicts ritual sacrifices, and the Northman hints at sexual humiliation. Audiences sense the unease beneath the surface, even when Hollywood softens the edges. Medieval chroniclers used tales of Viking sexual brutality as propaganda, branding them monsters to frighten Christian Europe. That legacy endured. For centuries, the word Viking was synonymous with savagery, lust, and chaos. Even today, history books wrestle with that tension. Were the Norse truly as depraved as the sources suggest, or victims of smear campaigns? Modern scholars admit the answer lies in the middle, but the horror of those accusations continues to define their reputation. Some of the most unsettling Viking laws remind us how sexuality shaped power. The idea that being sexually passive stripped a man of rights resonates with modern discussions of masculinity and honor. The Viking obsession with dominance echoes in cultures where insults to manhood still spark violence. Meanwhile, the legal autonomy of free Viking women, able to divorce husbands, inherit land, or run businesses, prefigured rights that would not appear elsewhere in Europe for centuries. The contradiction between female agency and brutal slavery still unsettles historians, challenging simple narratives of progress. Ship burials, rune stones, and museums across Scandinavia continue to draw crowds. Visitors marvel at the craftsmanship, but rarely consider the darker layers: the women buried as offerings, the law codes carved with hierarchies of flesh. Yet these traces force us to confront uncomfortable truths. Beneath the romanticized helmets and horned myths lies a society where power was inscribed on bodies, sometimes with blood. Above all, the Vikings linger in imagination because they embody contradictions: freedom and bondage, honor and humiliation, passion and violence. Writers, filmmakers, and even gamers return to them because their world feels both familiar and alien. They remind us that sexuality is never just private. It is political, cultural, and sometimes terrifying. And in their sagas, we glimpse how far people will go to defend honor, dominate others, or sanctify power through intimacy. The Viking Age may have ended, but its legacy still haunts us in the stories we tell, the laws we debate, and the images that flash across our screens. But beneath all the scholarship and spectacle lies the core question: what do we do with this legacy of lust and violence? Do we dismiss it as the cruelty of another age, or see in it a mirror of ourselves? That question is where we end, by turning to you. Crowds cheer when we speak of Viking glory, their ships, their raids, their sagas. Museums shine their swords under clean glass, and films remake them as rugged heroes. But beneath the polished steel and proud myths lies another story. A story of intimacy twisted into humiliation, of weddings turned into trials, of funerals drenched in sex and blood. A story where human beings became offerings, insults became death sentences, and honor was carved not only with swords but with bodies. The Norse were not unique in their brutality. Rome had its arenas. Medieval Europe had its witch trials. But the Vikings remind us of something deeper: how sexuality itself can be weaponized, used to dominate, to terrify, to control. They made intimacy into a stage of power, where every role was judged, every act carried consequence, and shame could kill as surely as steel. When you walk through a Scandinavian museum or flip through a glossy book of Viking art, ask yourself, what's missing from these images? Where are the voices of the slave women, the humiliated captives, the young brides trembling in chambers that felt more like courts than homes? History rarely preserves their cries, but sagas and bones whisper their echoes, and maybe that's the truest horror of all. Not that the Vikings lived this way, but that their obsessions with dominance, with humiliation, with power sanctified by intimacy, still resonate in our world today. We may flatter ourselves that we've moved beyond such cruelties, but have we? Or do the shadows of the longships still drift beneath our modern seas? So I turn to you. What do you think? Were these accounts exaggerated nightmares told by terrified enemies, or glimpses of a society that truly turned sex into spectacle and weapon? Do we see the Vikings clearly, or only through the smoke of propaganda and the fire of our own imagination? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I want to hear your theories. And if this story left you unsettled, subscribe to Hidden History Vault for more journeys into the darkest corners of the past. Because history isn't only written in stone or ink. Sometimes it's written in silence, in shame, and in scars that refuse to fade.